Imagine standing face to face with an alien warrior who calls your entire species weak. Now imagine proving her wrong, not with brute strength, but with something far more powerful. What happened next shocked everyone, including her. This is the story of how one human boy turned the tables on an alien empire, and how their rivalry sparked a bond that would change the fate of the galaxy. But be warned, this isn't just a story about survival. It's about what happens when two worlds collide, and the unexpected heroes who rise from the ashes. Story begins as the starship Eclipse floated silently in the vast expanse of space, its sleek metallic hull reflecting the light of a distant star. Inside the Grand Hall, the air buzzed with tension. Humans and aliens mingled uneasily, their differences stark under the soft glow of the overhead lights. At the center of it all stood Zara, a tall, blue-skinned alien girl with shimmering silver hair that cascaded down her back like liquid starlight. Her violet eyes glowed with confidence as she scanned the room, her arms crossed over her chest. She was the pride of her species, a warrior known for her strength and speed. And right now, she was looking at the humans with a mix of pity and disdain. "Humans are weak," Zara declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. She stepped forward, her movements graceful yet deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. "You lack the strength to lift a boulder, the speed to outrun a storm, and the endurance to survive the harshest conditions. You don't belong among the stars." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The humans in the room shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mix of anger and shame. But one person didn't back down. Jake, a 17-year-old boy with messy brown hair and a determined glint in his hazel eyes, stepped forward. His hands were clenched into fists, but his voice was steady. "You don't know us," he said, his words clear and strong. "Humans might not be the strongest or the fastest, but we've got something you don't." Zara tilted her head, her silver hair catching the light as she smirked. "Oh, and what's that?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Jake met her gaze without flinching. "Heart, and I'll prove it." The room fell silent. Even the aliens, who had been whispering among themselves, stopped to watch. Zara's smirk faded, replaced by a look of mild surprise. She uncrossed her arms and took a step closer to Jake, her violet eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You're serious," she said, more a statement than a question. "Dead serious," Jake replied, his voice unwavering. Zara chuckled, a low, melodic sound that echoed through the hall. "Fine," she said, her tone challenging. "Tomorrow, we'll have a competition. 3 challenges: strength, speed, and endurance. If you win, I'll admit I was wrong. But if I win," she paused, her gaze sweeping over the humans in the room, "humans will never set foot on this ship again." Jake didn't hesitate. "Deal." The crowd erupted into murmurs, some humans cheering for Jake, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Zara turned and walked away, her silver hair shimmering like a comet's tail. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake's best friend, Mia, grabbed his arm and pulled him aside. Her curly red hair bounced as she shook her head in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind?" she hissed, her green eyes wide with worry. "Zara's an alien, Jake. She's stronger, faster, and tougher than any human. You can't beat her." Jake grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. "Maybe not in the way she expects, but I've got a plan." Mia crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "What plan?" Jake leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You'll see," he said, his grin widening. "Just trust me." Mia sighed, shaking her head again, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "You're crazy, you know that?" "Maybe," Jake said, his grin never fading. "But crazy might be exactly what we need." As the two walked away, the grand hall emptied, leaving only the soft hum of the starship's engines. But the tension remained, thick and palpable. Tomorrow, Jake would face Zara in a competition that could change everything. And though he didn't show it, a small part of him wondered if he'd made a mistake. But there was no turning back now. The challenge was set, and the stakes were higher than ever. The Grand Hall of the Eclipse was packed to the brim the next day. Humans and aliens alike filled the space, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation. The air was electric, charged with the kind of energy that only comes when two worlds collide. At the center of the room stood Zara, her blue skin glowing faintly under the lights, her silver hair tied back into a sleek braid. She looked as confident as ever, her violet eyes scanning the crowd with a hint of amusement. Beside her was Jake, his messy brown hair sticking up in all directions, his hazel eyes focused and determined. He looked smaller next to Zara, but there was a fire in his gaze that couldn't be ignored. The first challenge was strength. A massive metal bar lay on the ground between them, its surface gleaming under the lights. It was no ordinary bar. It was made of a dense alien alloy, its weight equivalent to 10 humans. Zara stepped forward first, her movements smooth and deliberate. She crouched down, her powerful legs coiling like springs, and wrapped her hands around the bar. With a grunt, she lifted it effortlessly, her muscles rippling as she raised it above her head. The crowd erupted into cheers, the aliens clapping and whistling while the humans watched in awe. Zara held the bar for a few seconds before lowering it back to the ground with a loud clang. She turned to Jake, her lips curling into a smirk. "Your turn," she said, her voice dripping with confidence. Jake stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the pressure building with every step. He crouched down, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the cold metal. He took a deep breath, his muscles straining as he tried to lift the bar. It didn't budge. The crowd murmured, some humans shaking their heads while the aliens chuckled. Zara crossed her arms, her smirk widening. "Need help?" she teased. But Jake didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, circular device. He attached it to the bar, his fingers moving quickly and precisely. The crowd leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. With a press of a button, the device hummed to life, and the bar began to float into the air. Jake stood up, his hands free, as the bar hovered above the ground. The crowd gasped, their murmurs turning into exclamations of surprise. Zara's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of shock. "That's cheating," she shouted, her voice sharp and accusing. Jake shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "You said the challenge was to lift the bar. You never said how." The room fell silent for a moment, then erupted into cheers and laughter. Even some of the aliens were clapping, their respect for Jake's ingenuity evident. Zara's eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening as she glared at him. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But don't think this means you've won." Jake shrugged, his smile never fading. "We'll see." As the crowd began to disperse, Mia pushed her way through to Jake, her curly red hair bouncing with every step. "That was amazing," she said, her green eyes shining with excitement. "I can't believe you pulled that off." Jake grinned, but there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "Thanks, but that was the easy part. The next challenges won't be so simple." Mia's smile faded slightly, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You got this, Jake. Just be careful, okay?" Jake nodded, his expression serious. "I will." As they walked away, Zara watched them from across the room, her violet eyes burning with determination. She had underestimated Jake once, but she wouldn't make that mistake again. The next challenge was speed, and she was ready to prove that no amount of human ingenuity could beat her natural abilities. But deep down, a small part of her wondered if Jake had more tricks up his sleeve. And that thought, more than anything, made her uneasy. The Grand Hall of the Eclipse was alive with energy as the second challenge began. A long, narrow track had been set up, stretching from one end of the room to the other. The surface of the track shimmered faintly, a blend of human and alien technology designed to test speed to its limits. Zara stood at the starting line, her blue skin gleaming under the lights, her silver braid swaying slightly as she stretched her legs. Her violet eyes flicked toward Jake, who was standing a few feet away, his expression focused but calm. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, their voices a mix of excitement and skepticism. Could Jake really beat Zara in a race? Even with his clever tricks, it seemed impossible. Zara crouched low, her powerful legs coiled like springs, her fingers brushing the ground. She glanced at Jake, her lips curling into a confident smirk. Ready to lose, human? She taunted, her voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wheeled device no bigger than his hand. He placed it on the ground and stepped onto it, balancing carefully. The crowd murmured, their curiosity piqued. Zara raised an eyebrow, her smirk faltering for a moment. "What's that supposed to be?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Jake grinned. "You'll see." The announcer's voice boomed through the hall. "Competitors, take your marks." Zara crouched lower, her muscles tense, her eyes locked on the finish line. Jake adjusted his stance on the device, his hands steady. "Get set." The crowd fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Go!" Zara shot forward like a bolt of lightning, her speed breathtaking. The crowd gasped as she blurred past, her silver braid streaming behind her like a comet's tail. But Jake wasn't far behind. With a flick of his wrist, the device beneath his feet whirred to life, propelling him forward at incredible speed. The crowd erupted into cheers as Jake zoomed past Zara, his device leaving a faint trail of light in its wake. Zara's eyes widened in shock, but she pushed herself harder, her legs pumping like pistons. For a moment, it seemed like she might catch up, but Jake crossed the finish line just a fraction of a second before her. The crowd went wild, their cheers echoing through the hall. Jake stepped off the device, his chest heaving as he turned to face Zara. She skidded to a stop, her violet eyes blazing with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You use technology again," she shouted, her voice sharp and accusing. "That's not fair." Jake shrugged, his grin never fading. "You never said I couldn't." Zara clenched her fists, her jaw tightening as she glared at him. "You're cheating," she said, her voice low and dangerous. Jake shook his head, his expression serious now. "I'm using what I've got. You have your strength and speed. I have my brain. That's the point, isn't it? To show that humans can compete, even if we do it differently." Zara opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. She stared at him, her anger slowly giving way to something else, something like respect. "Fine," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "But don't think this means you've won. The last challenge is endurance, and that's where I'll crush you." Jake nodded, his grin returning. "We'll see." As the crowd began to disperse, Mia ran up to Jake, her curly red hair bouncing with every step. "That was incredible," she said, her green eyes shining with excitement. "I can't believe you actually beat her." Jake chuckled, but there was a hint of nervousness in his eyes. "Thanks, but the last challenge is going to be the hardest. Endurance isn't exactly my strong suit." Mia's smile faded slightly, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll figure something out. You always do." Jake nodded, but his mind was already racing. The final challenge would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And as he glanced across the room at Zara, who was stretching and preparing for the next round, he knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to make it easy for him. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome was anything but certain. The grand hall of the eclipse was eerily quiet as the final challenge began. A large, transparent chamber stood at the center of the room, its walls thick and reinforced to withstand extreme conditions. Inside, the environment could be manipulated to simulate freezing cold, scorching heat, and crushing pressure, a true test of endurance. The crowd gathered around, their faces a mix of excitement and apprehension. This was it, the final challenge, the one that would decide everything. Zara stepped forward first, her blue skin glowing faintly under the lights. She glanced at Jake, her violet eyes sharp and calculating. "This is where your tricks won't help you," she said, her voice cool and confident. "Endurance is about raw strength and willpower, and you don't have either." Jake met her gaze, his hazel eyes steady. "We'll see," he said simply. Zara smirked and stepped into the chamber. The door sealed behind her with a hiss, and the crowd watched in silence as the challenge began. The temperature inside dropped rapidly, frost forming on the walls and Zara's skin. She stood tall, her breath visible in the freezing air, her expression calm. Then the heat came, waves of scorching warmth that made the frost evaporate instantly. Sweat dripped from Zara's brow, but she didn't falter. Finally, the pressure increased, the air inside the chamber growing heavy and oppressive. Zara's muscles tensed, but she remained standing, her alien physiology handling the strain with ease. When the challenge ended, the crowd erupted into cheers. Zara stepped out of the chamber, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She turned to Jake, her smirk returning. "Your turn," she said, her voice dripping with confidence. Jake nodded and stepped forward. The crowd watched in silence as he entered the chamber, the doors sealing behind him. The temperature dropped immediately, and Jake shivered violently, his breath coming out in visible puffs. The heat followed, and he gasped, sweat pouring down his face. Finally, the pressure increased, and Jake fell to his knees, his body trembling under the strain. The crowd murmured, some humans looking away while the aliens exchanged knowing glances. Zara crossed her arms, her smirk widening. "It's over," she said quietly. But then, Jake did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, glowing orb. He pressed it to his chest, and a shimmering force field surrounded him, protecting him from the chamber's effects. The crowd gasped, their murmurs turning into exclamations of surprise. Zara's eyes widened, her smirk vanishing as she stared at Jake in disbelief. When the challenge ended, Jake stepped out of the chamber, the force field dissipating as he caught his breath. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the hall. Zara stepped forward, her violet eyes blazing with anger. "You cheated again," she shouted, her voice sharp and accusing. Jake shook his head, his expression calm. "I used what I had. You never said I couldn't." Zara opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. She stared at him, her anger slowly giving way to something else, something like respect. Maybe I was wrong," she admitted quietly. The crowd cheered even louder, their voices a mix of excitement and relief. But before anyone could celebrate, an alarm blared through the ship. The lights flickered, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. "All hands brace for impact. We're under attack." The crowd scattered, their cheers turning into shouts of panic. Jake and Zara exchanged a glance, their rivalry forgotten. "We need to work together," Jake said. Zara nodded, agreed. As they ran toward the control room, the ship shook violently, enemy fire striking its hull. The stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome was anything but certain. But one thing was clear. Jake and Zara would have to put their differences aside if they wanted to survive. And in that moment, they both realized that the real challenge had only just begun. The eclipse shuddered violently as another blast rocked the ship, sending sparks flying from the overhead panels. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the control room. Jake and Zara burst through the doors, their earlier rivalry forgotten as they took in the chaos around them. Crew members scrambled to their stations, their faces pale with fear. The captain, a tall human with graying hair and a stern expression, was shouting orders, his voice barely audible over the blaring alarms. "Shields at 30%, one of the crew members yelled, their hands flying over the controls. "We can't take another hit." Jake rushed to the nearest console, his fingers dancing across the keys as he tried to make sense of the situation. Zara stood beside him, her violet eyes scanning the data on the screens. "We're outgunned," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Their weapons are more advanced than anything we've seen before." Jake glanced at her, his hazel eyes sharp with determination. "Can your people help? Do you have any ships nearby?" Zara hesitated, her jaw tightening. "I can try to contact them, but it'll take time. We might not have that long. Then we'll buy some time," Jake said, his voice firm. He turned back to the console, his mind racing. "If I can reroute power from non-essential systems to the shields, we might be able to hold them off until help arrives." Zara nodded, her expression grim. "Do it. I'll handle the communications." As Jake worked, his fingers moving quickly and precisely, Zara pulled out a small device from her belt. It was a sleek, silver communicator, its surface etched with intricate alien symbols. She pressed a button, and the device hummed to life, a holographic interface projecting into the air. Zara spoke rapidly in her native language, her voice calm but urgent. The holographic screen flickered as it established a connection, and Zara's eyes narrowed in concentration. The ship shook again, and Jake stumbled, grabbing the edge of the console to steady himself. "Shields at 15%, the crew member shouted, their voice cracking with panic. "Almost there," Jake muttered, his fingers flying over the keys. He rerouted power from the life support systems, the artificial gravity, anything non-essential. The lights dimmed, and the air grew colder, but the shields stabilized. "Shields holding at 20%, he said, his voice tight with relief. Zara glanced at him, a flicker of respect in her violet eyes. "Reinforcements are on their way," she said. "But it'll take them at least 5 minutes to get here." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "We'll have to hold out until then." The captain turned to them, his expression a mix of gratitude and desperation. "You too, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You're the only thing keeping us alive right now." Jake and Zara exchanged a glance, their earlier animosity replaced by a shared sense of purpose. "We've got this," Jake said, his voice steady. Zara nodded. Together, the ship shook again, and the lights flickered, but Jake and Zara didn't falter. They worked side by side, their movements synchronized as they fought to keep the eclipse from falling apart. The crew watched them, their fear slowly giving way to hope. If anyone could get them out of this, it was these two. But as the minutes ticked by, the enemy's attacks grew more intense. The shields were down to 10%, and the ship's hull was starting to buckle under the strain. Jake's hands were trembling as he worked, his mind racing for a solution. "We need a distraction," he said suddenly, turning to Zara. "Something to buy us more time." Zara's eyes narrowed as she considered his words. Then, a slow smile spread across her face. "I think I have an idea." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What kind of idea?" Zara's smile widened. "The kind that involves a little risk and a lot of firepower." Jake grinned, despite the situation. "I'm listening." As Zara explained her plan, the crew listened in stunned silence. It was risky, maybe even suicidal, but it was their only chance. And as the ship shook again, the lights flickering ominously, Jake and Zara knew one thing for sure. They were in this together, and they weren't going down without a fight. The eclipse groaned under the strain of another direct hit, the sound of metal twisting and groaning echoing through the ship. The lights flickered, casting the control room in a dim, eerie glow. Jake and Zara stood side by side, their faces illuminated by the glow of the consoles. The crew watched them, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Zara's plan was risky, but it was their only shot. "We'll need to lure them in closer," Zara said, her voice calm but urgent. She pointed to the holographic display, where the enemy ships were represented as glowing red dots. "If we can get them within range of the Eclipse's pulse cannon, we might be able to disable their weapons long enough for the reinforcements to arrive." Jake nodded, his hazel eyes scanning the display. "But the pulse cannon hasn't been tested in combat. What if it doesn't work?" Zara's violet eyes met his, a flicker of determination in her gaze. "Then we're no worse off than we are now. But if it does work," she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The captain stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "Do it," he said, his voice firm. "We're out of options." Jay took a deep breath and turned back to the console. His fingers flew over the keys, rerouting power to the pulse cannon. The ship shuddered again, and the lights dimmed further as the energy was diverted. "Pulse cannon charging," he said, his voice tight with tension. "We'll need to hold them off for another 2 minutes." Zara nodded and activated the ship's external comms. Her voice echoed through the speakers, calm and commanding. "Attention, enemy vessels. This is Zara of the Eclipse. You are outmatched and outgunned. Surrender now, or face the consequences." For a moment, there was silence. Then, a harsh, guttural voice crackled over the comms. "You are in no position to make demands. Eclipse. Prepare to be destroyed." Zara smirked and turned to Jake. They took the bait. Jake grinned, despite the situation. "Let's hope they're as overconfident as they sound." The enemy ships moved closer, their weapons glowing as they prepared to fire. The crew held their breath, their eyes glued to the screens. The pulse cannon was at 80% charge, the energy building steadily. Come on, Jake muttered, his fingers hovering over the controls. The ship shook violently as another blast struck the hull. "Shields at 5%, the crew member shouted, their voice cracking with panic. "Almost there," Jake said, his voice tight. The pulse cannon was at 95% charge. The enemy ships were almost within range. Just a little closer. The ship shook again, and the lights flickered ominously. "Shields failing," the crew member yelled. "Now!" Zara shouted. Jake slammed his hand down on the console, activating the pulse cannon. A blinding burst of energy erupted from the eclipse, washing over the enemy ships like a tidal wave. The red dots on the holographic display flickered and went dark as the enemy's weapon systems were disabled. The crew erupted into cheers, their voices a mix of relief and disbelief. "It worked!" Jake shouted, a grin spreading across his face. Zara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Told you it would." But their celebration was short-lived. The ship shook again, and the lights flickered. "The pulse cannon drained our power reserves," the crew member said, their voice tight with worry. "We're dead in the water." Jake's grin faded, and he turned to Zara. "How long until the reinforcements get here?" Zara checked her communicator, her expression grim. 3 minutes. The captain stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "We'll have to hold out until then. Everyone, brace for impact." The crew scrambled to their stations, their faces set with determination. Jake and Zara exchanged a glance, their earlier rivalry forgotten. "We've come this far," Jake said, his voice steady. "We're not giving up now." Zara nodded, her violet eyes burning with determination. Together, as the ship shook again, the crew held their breath, their eyes glued to the screens. The enemy ships were regrouping, their weapons systems slowly coming back online. But Jake and Zara stood firm, their resolve unshakable. They had faced impossible odds before, and they weren't about to back down now. The reinforcements were on their way, and they just had to hold out a little longer. But as the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker and the stakes higher. The final battle was far from over, and the outcome was anything but certain. The eclipse was silent except for the low hum of its failing systems and the occasional creak of strained metal. The crew stood frozen, their eyes locked on the holographic display as the enemy ships regrouped, their weapons slowly powering back up. The pulse cannon had bought them time, but not enough. Jake's hands clenched into fists as he stared at the screen, his mind racing. Zara stood beside him, her violet eyes sharp and calculating, her silver braid swaying slightly as she turned to him. "We're out of options," she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "If they fire again, we're done." Jake nodded, his jaw tight. "There's got to be something we can do. We can't just sit here and wait for them to destroy us." Before Zara could respond, the ship's comms crackled to life. A deep, commanding voice filled the control room, sending a ripple of relief through the crew. "This is Captain Vaylor of the Starborn. Reinforcements have arrived. Hold your position." Jake's eyes widened, and he turned to Zara, a grin spreading across his face. "They're here." Zara's lips curved into a small smile, but her eyes remained focused on the screen. Not a moment too soon. Outside the eclipse, a fleet of sleek, silver ships emerged from hyperspace, their hulls gleaming under the light of distant stars. They moved with precision, surrounding the enemy vessels and cutting off their escape. The enemy ships hesitated, their weapons systems flickering as they realized they were outnumbered and outgunned. The Starborn fired a warning shot, a brilliant beam of light that streaked past the lead enemy ship, close enough to make its hull shudder. "This is your final warning. Captain Vaylor's voice boomed over the comms. "Stand down, or be destroyed." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one by one, the enemy ships powered down their weapons and raised their shields in surrender. The crew of the Eclipse erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the control room. Jake slumped against the console, his breath coming out in a relieved sigh. Zara placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but reassuring. "We did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Jake looked up at her, his grin widening. "Yeah, we did." As the reinforcements secured the enemy's ships, the captain of the Eclipse turned to Jake and Zara, his expression a mix of gratitude and awe. "You two, you saved this ship. You saved all of us." Jake shook his head, his grin fading slightly. "We just did what we had to do." Zara nodded, her violet eyes meeting the captain's. "We worked together. That's what made the difference." The captain smiled, a rare warmth in his eyes. "Whatever it was, I'm grateful. And I think it's safe to say you've earned your place on this ship." As the crew began to celebrate, Jake and Zara stepped away from the chaos, finding a quiet corner of the control room. Zara turned to him, her expression serious. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice low. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Zara hesitated, then took a deep breath. "The reason I challenged you, it wasn't just because I thought humans were weak. It was because I wanted to see if you were like him." Jake frowned. "Like who?" Zara's eyes softened, and she looked away. "My father. He was human." Jake's eyes widened, and he stared at her in shock. "Wait, you're half human?" Zara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yes, and when I saw you standing up to me, refusing to back down, I saw him in you. That's why I pushed you so hard. I needed to know if you were like him." Jake blinked, his mind racing. "So all of this, the challenges, the competition, it was because you wanted to see if I was like your dad?" Zara nodded again, her smile widening. "And you proved me wrong in the best way possible. You're not like him, you're better." Jake grinned, a warmth spreading through his chest. "Well, I guess it makes us even. Because you're not what I expected either." Zara chuckled, a low, melodic sound that made Jake's grin widen. "I guess we both have a lot to learn about each other." As the Eclipse drifted safely through the stars, its crew celebrating their victory, Jake and Zara stood side by side. Their rivalry turned to friendship. They had faced impossible odds and come out stronger, proving that strength wasn't just about power or speed. It was about heart, ingenuity, and the willingness to stand together. And as they looked out at the stars, they knew one thing for sure. Their journey was far from over. Here is the story ends. If you enjoyed and want to watch more thrilling sci-fi adventures, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Dive into epic battles, explore distant galaxies, and join brave heroes as they fight for survival against impossible odds. Let us know in comments if you want next chapters to publish soon. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and become part of the journey. Together, we'll keep the last light burning. Subscribe now and let the adventure continue.